So,
welcome.
Basically, what this is instead of writing an article for the ALD, I decided that it would be a better idea and a lazier way for me to do it, that I would make Sarah Brown and Andi Davis, two preeminent international lighting programmers, come to my flat and we would talk about programming, how we started, and what our job is. So the first thing probably to do is the thing that happens at meet and greets, is that we should go around the table and introduce ourselves. I'll start. I'm Victoria Brennan, and I am a lighting programmer.
I'm Sarah Brown, and I also am a lighting programmer for theatre.
And I am Andi Davis, and I'm also a lighting programmer.
The first thing that I am interested in is how each of us got started doing what we're doing. I was at college doing my A-levels in Stratford-upon-Avon, and I had not organised any work experience, and somebody had organised for a team of people to be down at the RSC running guided tours of some props workshops, and I got involved with that, and from there met people who worked at the RSC, and they very kindly gave me some work doing turnarounds, and then I got work follow spotting, and then I moved from being in the Swan in the RSC to being in the main house. And then somebody that you'll learn about in a moment, Andi Davis, set up a programming department, and I applied for and got a job within the programming department. And so the RSC trained me and put me on shows, and then I took voluntary redundancy, left, and became a freelance programmer. But there was a lot that went into that, so I started doing changeovers, then I was a follow spot operator, then I was a deck electrician. And when I started programming, I had never operated a show. The first time I operated a show was after I had teched it for a week, which seems like an odd way to do it.
I don't think
So
I knew
why did you start? Why were you programming when you hadn't operated? Have I just missed that?
I had been a follow spot operator, and the way things worked at the RSC was that you were sort of pigeonholed. So before we had the programming department at the RSC, everybody got to program a show pretty much throughout the year, which would mean that potentially it had been 12 months since the last time you touched the desk. But if you were a follow spot operator, you operated the follow spot, and that was all you did. You never operated the desk, you never programmed. It was very, that was the most junior role in the department, and that's sort of where you were kept. It was perceived to be a senior role to operate the desk because
it was a full-time, like the full-timers.
It was a full-time thing.
It was a full-time versus casual employment thing. So it's not so to do with seniority so much as full-timers were expected to actually take the responsibility of programming the desk, I guess.
Yeah.
Even though arguably operating shows is rather less demanding than.
But it was something that I remember we did after I had come on board as a programmer, that any new programmers, I suggested that they operate a show before they were trained to be a programmer, because it's a terrifying thing to be, like, it's a responsibility to operate the show, quite apart from being the person who programs the show. I think you are the person who's meant to have an eye on the show and who is meant to have an overall idea of when it's not right, I think. And I sort of learned all of that in one go, having done the programming and then going on now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's really that bad. I mean, I don't think I knew that, so probably I should have known that. That probably is bad. But I don't think, I think I probably operated a few shows. But I mean, it was catastrophic. Like, it was catastrophically bad whichever way you did it, if you see what I mean. So I don't know that would have been the miracle solution, which would have finished your path.
No, I don't think it was. But I think it was because the other thing to say is that I don't have any formal theatrical training apart from being on the job. I did my A-levels in Stratford, which were.
You trained as a dancer, is that not right?
No, I'm just a naturally gifted dancer. No training required.
It was a hair flick for those who can't see it.
I did A-levels in drama, theatre studies, English literature and law, and thought I wanted to be an actor at the time, and it was only because I had a crush on the boy who did lighting for the college that I decided I wanted to do lighting. And then I was lucky enough to meet people like Andi, and that having the privilege of being on comms actually as a follow spot operator and listening to the way that lighting designers interacted with programmers and the very close artistic relationship and also support relationship that seemed to exist there seemed to be something that was interesting to me. And I used to practice the key presses on my thigh. As the lighting designer would ask for channels, I would try and type
just for
as
those
quickly.
who can't see it, you're actually practicing those key presses on your thigh now.
One day I'll get better at my job, and until then I will keep trying. But I was very lucky to be able to sort of eavesdrop on that and have an insight into that without having to do it, I think. Because up until that point I didn't really know what it was, and the way it had worked at the RSC up until that point was that everyone got to have a go, and then it came to be a crunch point when lighting designers were asking to have freelance programmers come in and program shows for them, and there was a thought that that was a cost that maybe a publicly funded company shouldn't bear, and we should just have better programmers. And I was lucky enough to benefit from that decision.
Was this because of the advent of moving lights, so the programming became more complicated?
I think so. I think also,
involved
and I think
than it
lighting
was
designers were
before.
expecting more
Yeah.
than they had been before, and they had people that they were working with on a more regular basis who had all that stuff at their fingertips, and the person who hadn't touched the desk for a year
In a rep in an institution.
Yeah,
situation.
absolutely. And up until that point, they've been able to do the things that you need to do well at the RSC. They were able to do well, but when it became a more involved process, and even then, when I was at the RSC, we had 2 programmers on every show. Not necessarily, I think, because we needed it, but in order to make sure that everyone got hands-on experience.
So how was that split?
It depended on who it was. I think when Andi and I used to do it, we'd do a session on the front line.
It was terrible, wasn't it? I mean, it was absolutely awful.
It was awful. I would not recommend it.
No, I mean the aspiration that you should have a situation where nobody is critical to the, if somebody walks out the door and gets run down, the idea that shouldn't, cause everything to grind to a halt is a fair one. But I don't actually think, I used to find it infinitely more difficult programming with somebody else, because I actually used to find it used to screw up my...
I agree.
Like, you constantly fall over your own feet because you go to do something and someone else has already done it for you, and then,
So the way we tried it was that somebody would work live with the designer and the other person would be working in blind, tidying up all the other things.
Right.
But the thing that I have found more being like the one-man band that all of us are now when we program is that my thought process, even if I'm in live working with the designer, I'm still thinking about the thing that I need to go back and fix. And if somebody's gone back and done that...
It's really upsetting.
Well, it also... It might be that I'm doing stuff in live that I'm doing to try and countermand the things that I'm going to need to do, so I'm going to just try and negate that, and then somebody's actually made my life more complicated by the thing with the best intentions.
It doesn't even have to be that, does it? Like, fundamentally, is it not the fact that you have a list of things in your head that you know you've got to do, and you're toddling along quite happily doing those things? If you go back and then you think, well, I can't find that.
Yeah.
I know this live movie, and now I can't find it, and you're actually spending more time looking for it.
And it spins you out.
Than it would have, if you
But it also may be that you don't want to tidy it up. It also may mean that you want to keep it as it was for a certain...
But it's also that thing that I think you might have found when we used to do training at Guildhall, and we would always be presented with 2 students, and you'd always be trying to find the job for the student who wasn't on the keys to do, and it'd be like
magic
things like,
sheets came in handy.
can you do a magic? Maybe you can be the person who's writing down what potentially the presets should be called, or you could be labelling the cues. But also, actually, as the programmer, it's nice to be able to label the cues, because that helps you locate yourself within the show, or it helps you keep track, and what you think might not be the same as the person sat next to you as the other programmer. They might have a different way of locating themselves, and I always found it kind of easier at the RSC because there were 5 of us who worked very closely together, so we were all sort of a mind, I think. I think it's less easy if I were to hand off a show to Andi now, for example. I think our styles have diverged enough that it would take me a while to get in step.
Ultimately, we probably wouldn't be trying to swap back again. Do you know what I mean? Like, I probably wouldn't try to dep out to you for a day or whatever. I mean, the difficulty was what we were trying to do at the RSC, which was entirely legitimate, and what they were interested in doing is having nobody who was critical to the process, and that's...
And to my mind, I'm a little bit interested in that still to this day. I sort of don't want to be in a situation where a show relies on me being there, because... And I always said this at the RSC, if there's a problem with me, you'll probably have to stretch me out. If there's a problem with a member of my family, you'll just see flappy doors behind me because I'll have left.
Yes, yeah, fair.
And I think the majority of us who programme in the West End. That's a stupid way to categorise it, but at that level, I think we program in a similar enough way that actually between the 7, 8, 9 of us, however many there are, we could probably pick up a show file, but maybe
in
not
those
hand it back
situations,
off
I
again.
think people are going to be indulgent if you're going, I don't understand any of this.
So that's a healthy break. So I can ask Sarah Brown, where did you train? I genuinely don't know this.
Oh, you actually don't know? No. Well, I did a fine art degree.
Where did you do your fine art degree?
In a college.
Cool.
Were you in the witness protection scheme at the time?
Do we have to do that? I did a technology-based fine art degree, and I wanted to work in theatre when I left.
Did you know that before you went in, or was it?
Yeah, pretty much. And I considered theatre design for a while, and then when I left my fine art degree, a theatre local to my parents was opening, and so I basically visited them and just said I will do anything, any hours, and worked there constantly and learnt on the job.
Nice.
Which was quite painful, but also was great. So I worked all the time and primarily follow spotted, which I loved, and then I did hemp flying. So it was. So I had a training ground of working in a receiving venue where I did lots of different aspects of theatre. So I did a bit of stage management, I did a bit of hemp flying, a bit of sound mixing, a bit of lighting, rigging, all sorts, really.
And was that just casual, or was that
That was casual, and then I went on to be full-time, and also worked in lots of local venues, in a casual basis, and learnt that way, and then toured as a deputy Alex with a touring company, with an opera touring company, ETO.
And what made you decide to pick lighting?
I just seemed to, I just sort of had a hunch that I was going to be a bit better at it than other things, and also
flying, for example.
Hemp flying as a 5'3" woman
didn't go well. So yes, it was a bit like, actually I think there is a truth in that perhaps I did lean towards that more, and also towards the desk. I migrated towards the desk and seemed to be better at that area than I was
straight away.
Yeah, pretty much. Although I did all other aspects, I suppose, linked to lighting. But yes, I migrated towards the desk straight away.
And how long did you tour for?
Toured for 4 years, first as deputy and then as chief. And then after that, and there I programmed, the deputy and the chief would program a show each for the rep tour so the tours were twice a year, and we toured 2 shows in rep for each tour.
Did you always start in the same venue, or was it?
Each tour, like the spring tour would start in the same place, and the autumn tour would start in a different place.
And was that on the 500 series that you started?
Yeah. And then I worked at ENO as a technician, so and I also programmed at ENO. So there was no programming department.
And was it similar to the RT? Did everyone get to have a go at programming?
No, I don't think so, actually. I think there were just people who were more interested in it, and therefore those were the people that did it. But we also did other things as well. We also did everything else as well in the lighting department. And then from there I went to the National, and there, again, I migrated towards the desk, so I did everything else as well. I started at Littleton, but I tended to program, and while I was there was no programming department. I'm not even sure if there is a programming department now, as such.
I don't know.
I mean, I think you get employed.
Oh yes, you get employed
with specific programmers per venue, and then
I think you get employed as a
head
speciality
honcho.
within the department. Yeah, and you are under the umbrella of Dunmerfin, I think.
Yes, and then after that I went full-time freelance programming.
So that's a question that I'd like to ask, because I haven't answered it for myself. But what I think people will be interested to know, what prompted you to go freelance?
Yes. I preferred the idea of working for myself, and I wanted to work on shows. I didn't want to work in a venue. I understand. I am mostly interested in working on the shows or the creation of shows, I think. And also I prefer to be freelance, I think, because I am working to do a job. I'm attempting to do a job rather than my hours being counted.
Sure.
So that works for me better.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you train, Andrew?
No.
What did you do? Did you just appear in a cabbage patch one day?
I did indeed appear in a cabbage patch. I did lots of lighting as part of my A-level theatre studies, and I thought that was terribly nice.
Where were you living at the time?
I was living in the Warwickshire.
Lovely.
But it didn't really occur to me that was something that I could perhaps do full-time as a job. So I went and did a degree in political philosophy, but I spent most of the time hanging out of a lighting rig.
That's what you need to be a programmer, kids, a degree in political philosophy.
Or 3 years spent hanging out of a lighting rig, depending, as long as someone's paying the bill, who cares?
Where did you do your degree? Where were you hanging out?
I did my degree at York, and in some ways we were quite lucky at York because there was no, it was entirely an amateur scene at the time in York. There was nothing in terms of theatre or technical theatre on the syllabus. That there was no courses that you could do at York at the time, so it was entirely amateur. And some of the quality of the work that was done there, I think, was extremely high. It was extremely high. I wouldn't dispute that for a second. So I think that was really good. But then when I got to the end of being at college, I realised I would actually either have to get a proper job or go and do that for a job. There wasn't really any way of putting that off any longer.
Is that when you started work at the RSC? I should point out to people who don't know, which is probably the 2 people out of the 4 who are listening. I first met Andi Davis when we both worked at the RSC in Stratford-upon-Avon back in the early 2000s.
What was the question? I've forgotten.
So was the RSC the first place that you went when you got back from university?
Well, the thing is, I basically wrote to every theatre in Warwickshire.
I did the same thing. And Warwick Arts Centre was the only one who got back to me, and then I forced the RSC into it.
I have to say, literally nobody got back to me. And literally the only theatre company that were so utterly desperate that they were prepared to bring up somebody with literally no professional experience, I did have a little bit, but not very much, was the RSC. And I think it was Jack, in fact I know it was Jack Brain who rang me up.
The legendary
Jack Brain, a man for whom I have an awful lot to thank.
And who worked at the RSC for 45 years?
A long time, but I think it would be indelicate to mention how long. But he certainly has a very large role in my career, certainly. He rang me up and said, do you want to come and do some work? And I assumed it was somebody taking the piss, because if you write 15 letters to theatres in Warwickshire, you assume that the one that won't answer would be the Royal Shakespeare Company. But in fact, it was the Royal Shakespeare Company. And that was how I started out. And I started out as a Cassie and doing changeovers and false spot.
And because I know how I got onto the desk, because it's your fault.
Oh, yeah.
But whose fault is it that you got onto the desk? Did you become full-time very quickly?
No. I was not full-time quickly at all. I was a casual for, I think, 3 years. And then we were on a system of short-term rolling contracts. And it sort of became it was sort of the case that if you were eventually... Because there's a sort of weird thing, which is that everybody did the desk. And unlike now, it was not regarded as a particularly prestige activity. Right. In fact, it was regarded as a bit of a chore.
It was a chore, nobody had to do it. Yeah.
And so on one of the short-term contracts I was on, it was deemed that I should do some programming. And I think I did a morning with Keith Cookson, SNID, you remember, and was then stuffed on for a production of Othello. Which Peter Mumford was lighting, a designer who we both know well. And I cannot tell you what an unmitigated catastrophe it was. Okay? I can tell you that what actually happened is that I think by the end of maybe the second tech session, it ended with Peter shouting, "Will you please look at the stage?" Okay, over the cans. Okay, and I think Ollie Fennick had to come in and take over, and I was retired from the control room due to the unmitigated catastrophe that was unfolding before us. Okay. And if you wonder why, subsequently I became quite keen on the idea that we should have training. Okay. that is actually kind of drives it. So it was very much not a thing that people wanted to do, and that obviously changed subsequently when it became sort of a more prestigious kind of thing. But it certainly wasn't something that people necessarily were keen to do, and certainly I have to say my half a morning did not prove to be sufficient to get me through 2 sessions of tech with Peter.
Were you keen to go back on the desk after that? Or were you
no, I think I just cried a lot. I think that was that.
Because I'm intrigued, because you're so incredibly passionate, and I don't think this is one of the reasons I wanted to do this. I mean, it's weird that we're recording it, but I am fascinated.
I'm enjoying that bit. I'm enjoying That's my favourite bit.
But I'm fascinated by, I know how I got into it, and I know it's a slightly circuitous route, and I know that I get asked an awful lot. This is me shoehorning the reason for doing this podcast in. I get asked an awful lot by soon-to-be graduates, recent graduates, new people in the industry. How do I get to be a programmer? And my answer is always, well, it's not easy, and you start off by being a follow spot operator, or you start off by getting work experience at the RSC, and it's never really easy. And the thing that unites all the people who ask me is that they have a real passion to do it, and they've often had the good fortune to have done a course at drama school where they've had a lot of time on the desk, which is something that I never had before I started my career. But once I got on the desk, I was like, well, actually, I kind of like this. That's a lie. My first show I absolutely hated.
What was your first show? I can't remember.
I think it was Richard III
with
with Henry Goodman, lit by Tim Mitchell, which was phenomenal. I'd had 2 weeks intensive training in a beautiful room upstairs in the old main house of the RSC with incredible views out over the River Avon.
Are you saying that you were looking at the views rather than looking at the console?
Well, there's a Peter Mumford situation. Look at the stage. And I was too busy looking at the views, having a lovely time, starting work at 9 o'clock in the morning, finishing at 5, doing homework in the evening for 2 weeks, and then I was immediately put onto an actual show. Where there was no time that if I wasn't able to do it, and because I had you sat next to me because we were double programming, there would be moments where it would just become the case that actually it was more prudent in order to get the show on that you just took over.
Yeah, I mean, I seem to remember, two things. First of all, those weren't really double programming, because actually the idea was supposed to be that I didn't really press any buttons.
You were just riding shotgun.
Yeah, exactly. So I seem to remember what we used to do is we did 2 weeks training, and I mean, part of this was driven by the fact that I'd had a bad experience, the very first time I tried to do it. Kind of thought, probably, with the best,
best of intentions, always.
Yeah, thumbs up to Mr. Cookson, but I don't think half a morning really cut it, or whatever it was that we did. So that was part of what was driving this idea, that if you actually wanted to do it seriously, you need to invest time in it. And it was supposed to be 2 weeks, training in advance, and then 2 weeks heavily supported on a show, and then 2 weeks less heavily supported on the show. And I think that was the structure that it was supposed to be.
And I think that is absolutely what it was. I think from my point of view, being the person who was, I can see that now with hindsight. At the time, it just felt completely terrifying, because I do remember a point at which we were waiting for lighting, waiting for me, and I remember looking up and Henry Goodman was asking, what are we waiting for? And the stage manager pointed at me.
Amazing. It's Vic, everybody.
Oh God, I just need to be better really, really quickly. That's how this is. And that, as a baptism of fire, that was incredible. And anytime I do training with students at drama schools, it's lovely because you're in a very protected environment, and it's a learning experience for everybody. But one of the most brilliant things, and one of the things that I think it's probably hard to do nowadays, is to take a chance on somebody like I was at, I don't even know what age I would have been, 21 at that stage, with no previous experience, I didn't have a qualification in anything, but between you, Simon Spencer, Vince Herbert, Paul van der Heyden and Wayne Dowdswell, I think at the RSC at that stage, you guys had seen something in me and I had interviewed well enough in a field of however many people that I was able to do that. And
yeah, I mean, we were backed by a phenomenal amount of resources in terms of time.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, resources were not, there were not huge resources in terms of equipment at the RSC, but there were, the amount of time that was invested, 6 weeks to invest, it's basically 6 weeks of my time to train a programmer, and that is a lot of money, actually. So, I think that...
So who trained you?
Well, nobody. There wasn't really, I did a morning with Keith, as I say.
And then beyond that, what did you do? Just read the 500 series manual?
Yes, largely speaking, it wasn't really perceived as quite as a skill in the same way that it is now, as it's perceived as a specific skill. It was perceived as one thing.
It should be perceived as a skill.
But it was one small part of what you did as a full-time electrician, and nobody really trained you for it any more, I think, than people trained you for wiring a plug or whatever. Like, you had to go at it, and then you got smacked around the head if you weren't any good at it, really. And obviously the idea of what we were trying to do was to do something different and say, actually, you know what, this is actually probably complicated enough that if you're going to try and do it, you know, in real time with a real lighting designer and some real grumpy actors on stage, probably you should have had a bit of a practice first. And that's kind of what we were trying to do with that training program.
So then you just continued to learn on the job as you went along?
Yeah, I mean, I was immensely lucky because Ian Lofhagen dragged me back in, I think. I think I went for a therapeutic walk in the Welcome Hills or something. Ian Lofhagen, I think, dragged me back in and said, you know, you have to, you know, stiff up a lip and all that, and got it back on. And but I did do a load of work between that and the next show I was on was with Hugh Van Stone, everybody. Hugh was interesting because he was knew quite a lot about 500 series. He'd been a very big Galaxy program, I think, in his time. So there was quite a lot of stuff that he was wanting to do with the desk, and I was wanting to learn. So that was quite a good pairing in a lot of ways. And we did. I think I only got shouted at once. So I mean that was a huge success. And that certainly is. And it was myself and David Holmes was working on that as well, as the sort of associate. And I came out of that knowing how to do loads of things that literally nobody else, I think, knew how to do.
Honestly. And because of that, then did you put yourself forward to be the programmer, or did other people go, I don't want to do it?
No, I literally went overnight from being somebody who didn't know anything about it. And only because I was interested in it, really. It was because it's something I was genuinely interested in. And I was lucky because I got Hugh, and Hugh was quite interested in setting the bar as high as I was prepared to, you know, try to make it to be. And I learned just an enormous amount in that.
But going on from that, in terms of the RSC staffing, when he would come back, would he say, I'd want to work with And, or...
I can't remember if we ever let him back. I have a feeling we maybe didn't.
I believe he has gone back.
So, yes, I think not in my time.
Well, I think that might be the reason that we had a programming department, because I think Steve Parkinson came in and did a show when you were elsewhere.
That may be
and
true.
I think, partly that might be because Steve was incredibly good at his job, but partly it might have been the fact that if it wasn't you...
Like I basically think, because it kind of went from that, it was also paired with the fact that we had some pirouettes, which we had 4 pirouettes on that season, I think, which were the first moving lights that we'd had at the RSC. The aspiration, when we got them, the aspiration, I think, was that they would move on changeovers, but not in the show. And don't laugh, because people actually, this is kind of what people actually thought.
No, I'm laughing in recognition rather than in mockery.
Yeah, I mean, because it just seemed absurd now, but at the time, the suggestion that you might have robotic lights whizzing around in the middle of Shakespeare was not a thing that, you know, anyone would have signed up for. And the suggestion was that, you know,
well done.
Which was happening, I think, in opera houses in Germany and stuff, was this idea that you could have stuff which would be automatically changed on the changeover. And of course, the truth of the matter is that the moment you've got a moving light, people want to move it around. And I can remember Peter saying on that very show that Othello, I can remember him saying to me, the only thing that's interesting about moving lights is the fact that they move.
And he says that to this day. But probably not with a pirouette doing a zoom change.
No. So the pirouette, and by, I think, maybe later in that season, it got to the point where it had been decided that what we needed to do was we needed to have a conventional programmer and a moving light programmer.
Okay.
Because at that point, that was a thing that was happening quite a lot, because Rob was in the West End programming moving lights, and then the venue chiefs were on there, you know, the house desk doing.
Should we point it out for those that don't know? That's Rob Halliday. If you don't know who that is, Google him. Totally fascinating. You'll probably know about him from all the ALD campaigning, but if you don't know about his history before that, then there's a whole world that you simply don't know about Rob Halliday. Carry on.
I want to know about the world of Rob Halliday.
Let's go back to LSI.
No, I should have.
Just while we're on the subject of Rob Halliday.
Oh, yes.
He did teach me to program moving lights.
So that was my next question, is who taught you?
While we were at,
So before...
We had On the Town come in, and we knew that there were moving lights for that show, and we didn't know how to program moving lights properly. Yeah, so we basically, Rob Halliday came in and taught us how to program moving lights.
So before that...
Specifically for that show.
Had you taught yourself how to program on the desk, or how had you picked up your knowledge?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Okay.
Well, and various other people along the way. Yeah.
So then Rob came in to do moving lights, and that's...
Specifically, he came in to teach us how to program moving lights for that show, and then he mentored us for that show.
And for you, then, that has been a relationship that's carried on.
Yeah, so then I understood how to organise myself with movers, basically.
Because I think that's a thing that I think is interesting and important. I feel like I'm going to shoehorn morals into this because I watch too much Netflix.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that I found useful, because of how I trained and how I learnt, is having, and it feels a weird thing to say this while you're sat next to me, Andi Davis, is that having a mentor or somebody who I can rely upon, and if I have a problem, knowing that I have somebody to ring up, because it's a lonely life being a freelance programmer. When I was resident in a building, I would be able to sit in a green room or in a workshop and talk to other people who do a similar thing to me or having similar issues to me and ask questions. Is this normal? Are you seeing this? As a freelancer, you don't have that forum. You sit on your own in an auditorium, and if another programmer walks into the building, you freak out because you think you're going to be asked to leave. So you become very suspicious of other programmers, I think, in a way that I never was when I worked at the RSC. It was much more of a community. And I think that we do have a community of programmers, but it's not often that we sit like this around a table with glasses of wine and talk at length about programming.
I have to say, I think there's the greatest solidarity between freelance programmers now, particularly, I think ETC have gone a long way to facilitate this, is actually pretty good. And it's certainly the case when you go back to the 500 series days that there was nothing comparable, really, when I was...
That's interesting.
But when I was running the programming team at the RSC, when I programmed my first show in tracking on a 500 series, I did not know anybody else who had ever programmed a show in tracking on a 500 series. And there were people like Rob was doing it, for example, I'm sure Vic was doing it, but I didn't know anybody else, and I certainly wouldn't have had anybody I could have rung up to say.
But that's the thing that I think is that I enjoy about the way that I have learned how to do it, is having a mentor might be the wrong word, but having a built-in community because of the trust that I placed in that person, because of the way that they've taught me. The first person that I would call is always you.
Yeah.
And there's certainly been times when I know that, like, and you with Rob and you with Nick Simmons, I'm talking to Sarah now and you can't see me, because you've had a relationship with Nick when you worked at the National, that he would be someone that you trust and whose opinion you value. And I think that has come out of, I've been very lucky, I think, to have had that close relationship with somebody who does the same job as me, which is not something that I think you build up as easily when you become freelance. I think I've done it quite well with you, but I've never programmed a show with Sarah.
I know.
I've never seen Sarah program a show. But also, and it's that thing that you don't necessarily know the other person's style. So when you ask a question, you're not entirely on firm footing about whether, is it just me, is always how I start these conversations. Yeah. Because I wouldn't ask that of Andi, because I think I know how you program, or the way your brain would think about it. But I don't know that about you, Sarah, necessarily. I don't know about Warren or Max Narula or Stacey or Nick Simmons or any of the other programmers. So it would always be, am I just doing it wrong? Because the way that other people approach the desk is different to the way that I approach it.
But I think the fact that...
Or have I just not learned that?
Yeah, exactly.
I do think a shout out to ETC is worthwhile, nevertheless, because they've
I absolutely agree.
Extremely hard to try and provide more of a community.
Yeah.
There's partially through the forums, but also some actual real world meeting up and all that kind of thing.
But also the thing that I wasn't aware of up until a few months ago was the Facebook page, which I had never really known about, but is like an incredible resource for people. But the forums, certainly that's a more protected, you can kind of search for the things that you need within that. That ETC, I think, genuinely are interested in our opinions as end users of the desk and wanting to ease our workflow or understand what it is that is required of us as programmers is kind of interesting.
It's just that idea of a community is that didn't have, certainly under 500 series era, that doesn't have any equivalent, I don't think. Do you? I mean, did you feel like you ever hung out with other 500 series?
Well,
programs?
only in terms of after Robert sort of taught me how to program at E&O, I then went forth and programmed in a freelance capacity a little bit under his wing.
Yeah.
And also Vic Smurden, I forget.
Pine.
Thank you.
Yeah.
She was obviously programming a lot of shows in the West End at that time, and she had a collaboration of some kind with Rob.
Yeah.
So there was a community there.
But it was we absolutely, like sitting in Stratford, we had a little team of people. The one thing we absolutely did not do was ring up Rob and Vix and say, do you want to come up to Stratford for a pint? Do you know what I mean? Which
We
now,
were very protective of what we were doing versus what they were doing.
Yes, I mean, it was, and looking at from...
Seems dark now.
So looking at it from now, you think, well, why did we not do that? But, it wasn't the same because we didn't have a company that was necessarily interested in trying to do that, I suppose. And ETC have been quite keen, I think, to push that community thing. And even when I go back to when I was first learning EOS, I can remember, I'm going to say Nick, and was it maybe you, maybe Becky still, I'm not sure, people coming over the river from the National to where we were doing with Zorro, which was the first EOS show in the West End, coming over to see how I was getting on and, see if I needed any help or whatever. And, so there's a kind of community vibe about it right from the outset, I think, which is really nice.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think ETC were pushing that vibe.
I'm sorry to have to tell you that Vic's dozed off.
No, it's not that. I'm thinking about... So I think that there's a thing that we provide as programmers. So there's a broader question about what we consider our role to be. But a thing that I thought was interesting when you said it earlier was that when you were first programming, was that you were in the control room, which is something that sort of baffles me a little bit, because from when I started programming, we were always sat either next to the designer or in the row behind them, but never remote from them as you would be in the control room. And I find that fascinating. So was that the case for a long time, and who was the person who decided that the programmer should physically move to be
I think I said earlier that I think I only got shouted at once on Anthony Cleopatra with you, and that was an occasion where I got my mic turned off and I was talking to you, but he couldn't hear me, and he was like, "Will you talk to me?" Again, I thought, this would be easier if we were downstairs, wouldn't it? And I think it probably sort of comes from that era. But I mean, it also does come from the idea, at that point,
you wouldn't move the desk.
You would, nobody was very keen on moving desks. It was quite a big deal. And also the fact that, there was something, like you were technicians, ultimately. You were a technician who also did some work on the desk, okay? And my technicians lived was backstage and kind of in a control room, okay? Not in the stalls with
you were
creatives.
Crew, you were not part of the creative team.
And whilst I wouldn't necessarily wish to style myself as part of the creative team now, I would certainly say that the principal program is certainly in the stalls. It's not stuck somewhere 4 floors up where they can't tell what's going on. David Hames always talks about the ability to judge the mood in the room, and I think that's you cannot judge the mood in the room over cans from 3 stories.
But I find it fascinating that American programmers are still sat in the circle to this day, and they all thought I was mad when I sat in the stalls. Why would you want to be that close?
So the show that Rob taught us on the town is I think the first time we programmed in the stalls in E&O. I think it was the first time a desk had come out on E&O.
Interestingly, now that you say that, Rob came to the RSC to programme for Howard Harrison on a production of Tempest with David Calder, I do believe, playing Prospero. And I was on a follow spot, and it's the first time I can remember seeing a moving light programme. I bear in mind that Rob was pretty much the only one.
Yeah.
And I remember, one of the reasons that I've ended up doing what I'm doing, because I'm sitting on a false spot thinking, that looks like a black, I could have a go at that.
Made a tough choice there, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely, I'm on error. I'm pretty sure that Rob had the desk out on that, and it's possible that's where, going back to your question, it's possible that's where that came from.
I mean, he also, on that show, he came in and taught us, the people who were programming more than anybody else, he taught us tracking. So before that, we were programming in crossfades. So I owe a lot to him, actually.
Yeah. So then that leads me on to the slightly broader question, which I didn't really want to ask, and a lighting designer suggested that I ask. But I sort of see his point now, and that is, and I'm going to ask both of you because I don't know if I know how to answer this, but what do you perceive as the role of the programmer? Or that's not even the question. What do you think your role is personally? Because I think that's different as to the umbrella thing, because I think programmers are different to different designers, but I know what it is that I provide, I think.
I think each designer needs something maybe slightly different.
Okay.
The first thing I want to say is that it's a support role, it's a facilitating role, but it's also supportive. I think I'm aware that I'm next to the designer, I'm with the designer on the front line. Their work is being shown for the first time, mostly to them as well as everybody else in the room. And I am part of that. I am part of that team.
Because is it you that used to say, Andi Davis, that you can teach anybody to push the right buttons in the right order, but that doesn't make someone a programmer? Or have I said that and attributed it to you
I'm really hoping
in an unkind way?
I'm really hoping that I said it because it sounds great. So let's say that I said it. I might have done. It's possible.
It does sound like something
I've said quite a few things over the years, and some of them I don't remember. So,
I'll play this back to you and you can hear it.
yes, I look forward to it. Yeah. What was it again?
That you can teach anybody to push the right buttons in the right order.
Yes, that is true.
But that isn't what being a programmer is. That is part of it.
Yes.
That's undeniable. If you don't push the right buttons in the right order, you're
You can
probably
get
not
quite
going to
frustrated.
get a job again. But just being able to perform those tasks is not necessarily going to get you employed for different reasons, because actually what a lighting designer might require is something different.
I think probably if I did say that, and if so, well done me.
Yes, congratulations, I'll make you a teacher.
I've done extremely well. I think part of the problem was certainly, there's a thing in the early days, and I mean, I think there still is a thing now where people think of programming as being a very, very technical thing, and it is a technical thing, obviously, but that's sort of the technical thing is the sort of bit before you can, you've got to have mastered that before you can get on with the actual programming, really. Programming is not the, with the people that I've trained over the years, and I've trained a lot of people, there are a lot of people who are technically very proficient, who struggle to then go on really to be programmers, I think you could say. And that's certainly not because they didn't have a great technical understanding of the desk, but that isn't actually the be-all and end-all of it. Yeah. That's about sort of 15% of it, and then the rest of it is a whole heap of other stuff, which is a combination of kind of a bit of art and a bit of politics and a bit of knowing when to keep your mouth shut, basically. I
think that is like easily 30% of it.
Yeah, it is. Really,
is knowing when not to talk.
Yes, even when invited to talk, when knowing not to.
Or when just to go, and just to say yes. And that's, I think, one of the things about sitting either next to the designer or at least close to the designer is knowing what it is that they're actually asking you. Are they actually asking you for an opinion, or are they in need of some support and a bit of a boost at that point? Because the director's just come and given them several notes, and the choreographer's come along, and then someone else has come along, and the production manager says that we're overrunning on something, and actually...
And they are managing the room.
And it's that really tricky thing, as you say, that the lighting designer is the one person in the room who is having to make all of their mistakes in public. And Neil Austin said a brilliant thing when he did the podcast on which this is based, the choreopathic, in one podcast, when he said it is similar to a designer getting a piece of fiberboard and doing a straight cut, and the director going, I wasn't really thinking, I was thinking softer rather than straight. This isn't it. I've barely even started. I just need time.
I think it's also worth, because I totally buy that. I mean, it's also worth bearing in mind that the joy of lighting is its flexibility. Okay, so what makes it a last minute thing? Okay, you also have the ability to go a bit softer, no problem, guys. We could generate.
But that's the point at which you really rely on a programmer to be able to pull all of those things and to have.
Yeah. I think that's also the joy of the flexibility of being a programmer and working with different designers. Is the designers are all different, and what their needs of you is therefore slightly different, and gauging that as a programmer is interesting. I find that increasingly interesting.
Well, that is largely that's after you've done the 15% of typing quickly, that's the other bit, isn't it? Really, it's working.
That's actually the fascinating bit.
It's popping on the Kofi Annan beard and working out the diplomacy of your role.
Yeah.
Working out your role.
Yeah.
On each job, working out what your role will be.
Yeah.
And that's the answer to the question, isn't it? If the question is what is the role of the programmer, the answer is to be determined based on the specifics of the occasion.
Yeah.
But that's also the fun of the role.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, just the same every time in ballroom, isn't it?
Yeah, you sort of adapt to fill the space that is required of you or is left for you, depending on the style of the designer.
Yes.
Some will ask you to step up and be proactive and engage, and others will ask you to step back and react and just support and enhance. And Peter Mumford is always very good. He refers to or describes programmers as editors, as in a film, so that what we do is we're able to trim or augment or enhance or suggest modifications, partly because more and more, certainly with Peter as an example, he has kept up with technology less than other designers have, and so when something new comes up, I'm the person as the programmer who is required to know what the capabilities are of that piece of equipment.
Yeah, and I think that's inevitably the case, isn't it? With like if you've got, for example, a big pixel mapped surface or something like that, like knowing part of this is a specific example, but understanding what that surface might be able to provide and the tools that you're going to need to provide that is part of what you bring to the game as a programmer, I would say. So, and that isn't something a lighting designer should not need to understand that, I suppose.
They shouldn't need to, but I think there's some who like to have a very tight control of the design because they see it as wholly their work. So I think it's useful as a programmer to have those tools in your back pocket.
I think it's probably scary from a lighting designer point of view, but I suspect the most rewarding version is genuinely where you do have people bringing things to the party from both directions.
I agree.
That you've got a lighting designer who's going, I've got this idea that we should do something amazing with this wall and it should do these things and this is what I'm kind of thinking. And you've got somebody else who's going, okay, I know technically that this can deliver this, okay, but could these things match this requirement? And I think that's the most exciting, that's the exciting point, is where those two things combine.
Yeah.
I know certainly from the one design that I've ever done in my life, there was one person that I wanted to have sat next to me, and that was you.
Yeah, he was terrible, wasn't he?
He was absolutely awful, but he was cheap and available, Andy, and that's
we only
the
had
best.
one monitor as well. And
We did only have one monitor.
It was just literally the worst. It was the worst of times.
And it was a theatre that doesn't have lighting anymore, so we did a terribly good job.
So we feel bitter.
But partly what I needed was that I knew that I wasn't going to be able to come up with, and the thing that it seems to me that lighting designers are required to have constantly is 75,000 new ideas ready to go at any given moment. And I just knew that I wasn't going to be able to have that. And if I had somebody next to me who I had a hunch could do that, or who I knew confidently could do that, that there would be moments where I could just turn and look at you and just go, what do you think?
Well, you can also do things which, like on that show, we spent a lot of, I think I spent a lot of time independent of you working on the pixel stuff, for example. And that's the kind of stuff I think sometimes it's good to just have a second set of hands, really, because it's very time-consuming trying to design. This
sounds a bit obtuse. Sorry, I should say this is, I designed Midsummer Night's Dream at the Globe 2 years ago, and Andy programmed it. And actually it was lovely having you do things like just softening the edges on things and just making things look nicer whilst I lashed in a load of cubes.
Yes, correct. And that's sort of part of the advantage, I think, of having two sets of hands. Yeah. Because actually if you're trying to, as a designer, if you're trying to generate a shitload of looks in no time at all, having somebody who's making notes and saying at 2 o'clock tomorrow morning I will make this transition not look like a bag of old balls.
Oh, don't make me sound awful by making you do work at 2 o'clock in the morning.
He's outside. Do you know what I mean? It's an outside venue, boy. There's not many other times you're going to do it.
You must stay till 2
o'clock in the morning. Pixel mapping. But yeah, I think, I do think that's part of what the deal is.
And I certainly think that's where my skills lie. Like, I'm not good at understanding the ones and the zeros and how the desk is generating the things that it's generating. And one of the things that is brilliant about ETC's work with all of us and their desire to engage with us is that I can just say, well, this doesn't work. I want it to do this. It does not do this. Please make it better. And I don't have to engage with that. Whereas I think Andy is better at doing that, because I think you really enjoy and are interested in the why.
Yes, I also, you know this, Bold, but I also believe that your chances of getting things changed about a desk are better the more comprehensively you note the problem and suggest the solution.
That is not true. I just complain and things change.
I would say you complain and things change after a period of time. I'd like to think, whether ultimately the time is well spent, because it is very time consuming.
Yes.
The more you, if you really, really want to provide reproducers and all that kind of thing for everything that you think is wrong, it takes an enormous amount of time. So whether that is time well spent is a totally different question.
But I think it is time well spent, because I think it gives you, I think you have a better overview of the desk and how it works than I do, whereas I just more often than not get frustrated and feel like a bad programmer because I am not able to explain or understand why it's happening, and I just then have to explain. That's the other tricky thing about being a programmer. When you are enthralled to a desk, you are determined, like the ability for you to do your job or what the lighting designer requires is sometimes hemmed in by the desk's capability, and what the designer wants may not be what the desk is able to provide, and we will try and turn somersaults with the desk, but sometimes either the designer is not talking in the right way or what they are asking is not achievable, although in their mind it absolutely should be. And sometimes that can be a bit frustrating, and I feel responsible, stupidly, I think.
Well, ultimately, there isn't a division, really, is there, between you and the desk in terms of the
you are one and the same thing.
Yes, absolutely.
As the designer.
For better or for worse, you're kind of tied into. And
I have made that choice. I work on one lighting desk, and that is EOS, and that is what I understand, and so therefore I am.
I can't imagine any scenario in which I would be programming, and if it wasn't going well, even if that was down to the desk, in which I wouldn't expect to copy it. You know, I mean, and when we go back to it, we did a lot of beta testing at the 500 series at the RSC, and I mean, every time that was falling over or doing shambolic stuff, I mean, you absolutely expect to get it in the neck, and you do. So, it's just part of the deal. So you stand or fall by that technology, and I think that's part of
one of the reasons I don't do much beta testing on big shows, because I at least want to be standing or falling by something that I know to be right.
So, yeah, fair.
Andy, you were programming support on Dream of Gerontius at Royal Festival Hall, a choral piece. Shows doing pre-plotting, pre-visualisation work, and whether that is useful, whether that is time-consuming and you're just going to undo it, whether anyone's prepared to pay for it, whether designers have the time or the knowledge of the show beforehand to do it. I kind of enjoy it. I'm in the middle of pre-production stuff for 9 to 5, and we have a set that has an awful lot of lighting elements on it, and trying to get looks in the desk that I can pull back and that we can maybe play with feels more comfortable going into.
Do you make a distinction between your programming preparation and pre-plotting in terms of sort of lighting pre-plotting?
If a lighting designer is there, I call it something else. If it's me, so I will always do prep on a show regardless.
So would you say what you're doing at the moment is prep, and that, because it seems to me those are slightly two different questions, although there's a bit of a grey area.
Well, that is interesting. Yes, so.
Thank you.
Well done. So I prep for every show. So I draw magic sheets for each show. I do layouts of presets, layouts of scenes, layouts of things for spots and stuff. And I spend a couple of days, anywhere between 1 day and 4 days, sorting all of that stuff out so that I have a set of building blocks in the desk ready to go. And then additionally, it is becoming more regular for me to do stuff with lighting designers, where we either sit with a previs, a WYSIWYG, or a capture of the set and the lighting rig, and we work out cues and looks for big numbers, or we work with a magic sheet if it's stuff that's kind of set based to try and work out effects and looks that we're going to want to pull. But I don't remember doing that much of that. I remember back in the day, I would sit with the lighting plan. I would have the A0 or A1 copy of the lighting plan.
Very big lighting plan.
And I would learn the rig. I would learn the positions of the rig. I would learn the numbers of all the channels, so that a lighting designer was able to talk to me in more general terms about something from over there or that mover there, without them having to constantly refer to and take their eyes off a stage. And that's become easier now with magic sheets that are on either an RVI in front of them, or that they've got their laptop, or that I just, now when I draw the magic sheet, I learn the rig.
I was going to say that's actually our learning process, is just part of doing the prep now, isn't it?
I mean, I'll freak out when we can import the vector.
But do you really find yourself doing that much more? I mean, other than prep, which I totally agree on, I mean, I still don't feel like I do that much. Like, I can't remember the last time I was sat in a previous studio with a lighting designer. I mean,
Gerontius.
But Gerontius probably, which is like 18 months ago. I mean, you know, and but I can't think that I've done anything since. It still doesn't seem to be something that we do that often. Sarah Brown is shaking her head, everybody.
I'm shaking my head. No, same for me.
So,
I don't think so.
Maybe it's wanting to have as many things up your sleeve as you can before you get into the building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I get the logic. It was more a kind of observation about what actually... Because, I mean, I think if I were, God forbid that I was a lighting designer, but I mean, if I was, I think I'd be prevising the shit out of everything. But,
well, I think, I mean, shout out to the woman who's made us do this, Lucy Carter, who I think prevised for Jamie going into town. I know that Prema prevised for Fame. Does Ben Cracknell previs? Sarah Brown works with Ben Cracknell an awful lot.
I don't think on the shows we've done together, but I think he does.
Because I think Rock of
some
Ages he
shows.
did, didn't he?
And yeah, I think he previses for the Oliviers.
Sure. Because they've got zero time to
I
make
think
that happen.
doesn't it depend on time? How much time
Yes,
that you
of
have?
course it does.
That you might do some.
But there are, I mean, James Whiteside is always, like, I mean, I kind of always say, oh, should we do some previs on the show? And he's always like, oh, would we have to? So well, no, it's not compulsory, it's fine. And I think he's, I think some designers are very comfortable making the work in the space with the people.
But is that also a symptom of maybe 5-10 years ago? I remember having a conversation with Tim Mitchell where he's like, well, I mean, I've previs one show, and then by the time I got it into the space, it was all crap anyway. None of the things seemed to line up.
That is a
Yeah, maybe.
And I think that's become less and less. I think that the spaces which we previs in terms of WYSIWYG or Capture or whatever it is that we're using to do that seem more successful.
But when you've been prevising recently, does this not mean that you need to have made a lot of decisions about the rig before you get into the space, and therefore you're fundamentally having to do a fit up several weeks before you do the fit up?
Well,
do you find that?
I haven't found that because I'm not the one who's drawing the space in Capture or WYSIWYG. We are getting some other poor bird
but I mean, in
to do
that. Of the designer has to make decisions
whereas my front of house
earlier than
moving's
perhaps
Well, the designer is
the rehearsals might be enabling them.
Yeah, and often the most problematic thing that I have found is that depending on how early we're trying to do the previs, the decisions aren't necessarily about where the rig is. The decisions are about the fact that they've only rehearsed the first scene.
Exactly.
So they're having to. But with quite a lot of it, the stuff that I am doing when I'm doing previs with designers is that we're looking at numbers, and they've already got those, so they know where the beats are, and we're basically looking at air looks. We're not looking at lighting somebody in a specific position. We're trying to do the world around them.
And do you previsit, do you model only a part of the rig? Like, for example, do you go, look, we're just doing this, we're just going to do the overheads, because basically we want the Sharpies. Is that sort of the...
Yeah, overheads and floor package, often, if we have a floor package. So Sarah and I have both done kudos pantos recently, but even if we could just do the flim flam that's around the cross, so the stuff that's front facing, just to kind of go, well, I know that we're going to do 2 numbers from Greatest Showman. I know that the BPM of those numbers is this, that, or the other. Just trying to get some of that sort of stuff and have a little look, because you're so short of time. It always seems to me that panto would be the ideal time to previs stuff, because you can just sort of make that eye candy in advance, because it's not dependent on a performer, it's not dependent on choreography, it's not dependent on the set, particularly in those instances, because it's a load of things on an advance, some strips at the front, and maybe some movers that are going to shine out in the auditorium, and it doesn't really matter where they are, as long as they're doing a circle effect or a figure of 8 and a rainbow chase. Then we know that the lighting designer is going to at least be seen to be doing something, so that's ticked a box.
Yeah, I mean, is it a bit like getting a structure in of a cue structure before you go into tech, that you get a kind of
that's
BPM structure or...
there was
ideas structure in.
An associate that I worked with in America, and he said that now, as standard, one of the things that he asks for up front is he talks to the MD and just gets the BPMs for every single number in the show, because someone at some point might ask. And the worst thing is that they don't ask, but if you don't have it, they're always going to want to know the information.
I certainly had that on the Kudos Panto I did recently. I had a whole list of them.
Well, I think that's going to go onto my list of basic things, just who's the MD, can I just have a list of BPMs?
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that sort of stuff more and more is useful.
But that's kind of quite interesting, because, I mean, going back probably 15, maybe more years, Adi Barnes and I were sat at Stage Electrics, and we were doing exactly the same thing, which is that going at Fever, we weren't trying to visualise any silly shit to do with lighting the actors or anything like that. What we were interested in doing is what we were at that time called the dominoes, which is basically air looks going into floor looks. Okay, and that's what that was about. So it doesn't feel like that proposition is, like, I can tell you that the rendering of what you see on the previous screen is probably considerably better than the sort of wire cones we were looking at. But ultimately, it seems that the expectation has not actually changed. And certainly, I don't feel like there still doesn't seem to me to be a great call. We're doing a play in the West End. It's 2 acts and 2 hours or whatever, and we should definitely previs that. That doesn't seem to have been. It doesn't seem to have changed in that way.
No, And there was a point at which, maybe 10 years ago, that I thought, actually, this might be about to change if they can make it good. But actually, for a play, what are we going to do if we've already prevised it?
Yes.
Why would we?
Yeah.
We suddenly become completely redundant.
And also, all the decisions when you're doing a play are decisions that they're made in the room, aren't they? They're being made right now.
Yeah.
Where is Dame so-and-so going to stand?
Yeah.
You just don't know until...
And what's the feel of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very much about reality, what's in front of you.
Yes, yeah. So, whereas... So I don't know, that brief doesn't seem to me to have changed enormously in 20 years. The technology we've got to do it is different, but the actual, what you're doing.
And I find it quite strange when I do previs. I find it quite odd to get motivated because there doesn't feel to be the same pressure to me. Like when I'm sat in a theatre in the dark with a load of people waiting, if I'm sat in a lovely office with a window, and I know we're only working until 5 o'clock. I mean, this is a terrible thing to say. Please stop listening now, production managers. But it is hard to find the impetus and the drive because that work will still be there and it's the deadline, it's still ages away. And actually, we're still going to like the show between now and then.
Well, sometimes I kind of feel like sometimes when you're in those kind of environments that you actually have more time and space to make the right decision. Like, sometimes in theatres you end up slamming in shit that is basically a load of old nonsense because you've got to come up to something right now. Okay, and
then the terror is that you've got to unknit that at some point
to
put the right thing in.
It's certainly to be said for doing, what you might find if you do a late night calls, for example, and it's just the designer and the programmer and someone hanging around to switch off, that what you achieve in that time, in that calm headspace, is very, very enjoyable and often really good quality.
Yeah.
Because you have time to think without being pressurised from any other forces.
But I think that's interesting because that's happening after the pressure. I think when it comes before the pressure, I think there's less of a release.
You've got a taste of the rig.
Exactly. And you've started to learn the rules of how you're going to light it. The problem is when you're doing the previs is that you're starting to dictate the language without actually seeing the real thing. And it's always that thing that I remember when we used to do Dirty Dancing years ago is because the tech would take so long. You'd take 4 weeks potentially to tech the show. Then by the time you got to the dress rehearsal, you'd put the preset up and go, what on earth is this? This doesn't look like the rest of the show. And you'd learn how to light the show as you'd gone along. And then that meant that the language that you'd started with felt completely foreign.
That's not just the lighting designer and the programmer. That's also the director.
That's everybody else.
That's everybody is learning.
Yeah.
Everybody gets to the top of the show and goes, Christ, what did we do?
Yeah. What happens next?
Yeah.
I know there's a blackout, but then what do we do once we come out of that?
Yeah. I was quite interested, do you still do a lot of late calls on shows?
Sometimes.
Because that's something that other than venues which are outside, obviously, in which case, you're working a 2 till 2 schedule, so that's completely different. But I cannot remember really the last time I did a show where I walked into the venue at 9 o'clock in the morning and walked out at 2
o'clock in the morning
on a regular basis.
So it depends on the schedule of the production, I think, and what we're trying to achieve within that time. And perhaps I have worked on what feels like fairly large musicals that have a production period which feels quite short.
Yes.
And so therefore, to give it the right quality, you may need to do more hours than there are allocated to you.
Because I think that's the thing that's put us under the most pressure is I think in as long as I've been doing this professionally, which is 15 odd years, is that I think that the budgets of shows have increased a little bit. I think the ambition of shows have increased exponentially. I think they have gone up like 300% from what I remember us doing. And admittedly, I started in Shakespeare and now I work in musicals. So that is a difference in general. But I think it is true that I think directors' ambitions for shows have increased. But I think that the schedules have not changed at all in the time that I have worked.
It's also worth saying that the tools that you have available, like it's certainly true that, the complexity of the technology that you're trying to control is far greater. Okay, that is absolutely true. And the kind of dynamic range, if you like, of the stuff you're being asked to generate is far greater. Of course it is. But that, also the range of tools that you have on a console for generating that stuff is also considerably greater. So it's, like everything's changing it's not necessarily clear.
Do you think it's always true? I always feel like I want an extra 2 days. Do you think that's always been the case?
Yeah. I do feel like that. What I would say is that which is why I actually asked Sarah this question, is that when I first started doing Fashion Trash musicals, which is going back into the early 2000s, the expectation there was that you loaded in on a Sunday. And every night had a late lighting call that went on till 2 a.m.
I'd forgotten that, yeah.
Well, it's actually 3 a.m. I don't know why I'm making
Don't dress it up.
Okay. And we're not talking about putting together a few lighting stakes. We're talking about hardcore shit. Do you know what I mean? Like, really, bear in mind it's all on 500 series, heavily number crunchy shit being produced at 3 o'clock in the morning to be played back at 9 o'clock the following morning. And I certainly don't remember any of those calls feeling like we had greater headspace to, consider the artistic policies of it. It was about a desperate attempt to stay ahead, okay? And that's going back to the early day, to 500 series and, sort of in the early 2000s or whatever.
So since you've worked on EOS family desks, have you done, apart from Regent's Park, open air shenanigans anywhere, have you done a late night, apart from a panto?
That's quite a difficult question, just because that's quite a long time. What I would say, I think it's a good moment to say it, is that the amount of stuff that EOS takes care of for you is absolutely enormous compared to a 500
It is
series.
true that I get all of my lunch and dinner breaks now in a way that I did not when I was working on 500
when we
series.
were in those days, when we were putting together Fashion Trash shows, which already involved the lighting designer and the programmer working every minute of every hour that was available, it was entirely unclear as to when you could possibly try to do any homework or clear up the show, because literally you're in bed for 4 hours.
That was the point at which you needed 2 programmers not on The Tempest.
Correct. So if there's been a big difference, I think, is that it's much, EOS, and I'm sure other consoles as well, are much faster. There's far less time spent doing homework and sorting shit out than there was then.
The housekeeping is far less labour-intensive.
And that makes an enormous difference. And it makes an enormous difference when you're working normal hours, because you actually get somebody says let's have a coffee break, you actually think, I'll go and have a cup of coffee, rather than this is my opportunity to try and fix the last hour and a half's worth of carnage.
This is when I breathe.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite easy to forget the fact that basically breaks were my work time, if you see what I mean, on 500. So that's not that the case, and that is a good thing.
There are still moments where I say, but it is far less frequent, where I say, do you mind if I fix that on a tea break? But that used to be every break on a 500 series.
Very occasionally you do a show now. I did a thing at the Donmar where we had moving lights working as follow spots, okay? And that, in fact, you came and covered on some of it.
I did a little bit.
The King's Cross.
Yeah.
I think I also covered you.
Yes, I believe you did.
Yeah, I did.
One of these filming calls.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because that technology drove a coach and horses through everything that EOS had to offer in terms of support, because I worked through every break on that, and it's really good to just occasionally do one like that and go, oh yeah, I remember it used to be like this all the time. I should be more appreciative. Because actually that's what it was like. It was like that all the time, and so
I do often take for granted actually how much of that donkey work the desk now does for me.
Yeah, and also the fact that ultimately the aspirations that you can have for the quality of the show file is infinitely higher, infinitely sooner than was ever possible on 500 series. So, you would not hope to aspire on a 500 series to think that you would be able to have no dark moves in the show whilst you're teching in real time. That's not even vaguely realistic aspiration, particularly on a big show on 500 series.
You wouldn't even consider that you wouldn't have a live move on a 500 series while teching, to be fair.
Because you've got 400 people breathing down your neck, and you've got 110 moving lights to look at, and you have to look at everyone manually, individually, So the aspiration, so that is why it's kind of a bit difficult to compare, I think, because it is true that the aspirations of the designers and the creative teams as a whole are infinitely greater. It's all driven, a lot of it's driven by, stuff from TV and rock and roll shows, kind of visuals. So
and what they think the audience expects as much as
exactly. Well, it is.
And how much we're charging the audience for tickets.
Yeah.
And therefore what the audience are prepared to accept for their 75 quid.
It's really good then, haven't it?
Yes, and it better be good from the first show.
Yes.
It's interesting that that is potentially something that is going to start to weigh more heavily on designers, is that the shows are no longer... It's the thing that happens anytime I do an NT Live or a full broadcast performance, where I stress out about things and the person who's looking after the filming of it always goes, well, the thing you've got to remember, Vic, is that, theatre's just for one night, but film lasts forever. And I feel very funny when audiences come and see those shows that are filmed, because they, for me, feel very artificial in terms of how we've had to recreate stuff. But there's also a world in which, when I've done TV stuff, some of the things that I've learnt from rewriting the cues or adjusting things for telly, actually sometimes the shows just look better because actually we've given a bit of context. There's something interesting about how those two things inform one another.
Yeah, and also I guess the preset may not have had quite as much consideration as it now does because it's being photographed.
Preset and post-set, absolutely.
Which is quite, that is interesting.
Certainly I know when I see other people's production shots on Twitter, I go, oh, really? That's an odd choice. And if I'm going to be catty about somebody else's thing, that means that there's 100 people queuing up to be catty about anything I've done. So why wouldn't we make the best effort? And as long as it isn't compromising the design in any way. But it is interesting that that's now become a concern, and that is something that I hadn't anticipated that I would have to engage with. And I had thought that we'd sort of reached the peak in terms of my exhaustion, and let's try and get this an enormous musical on in 4 days. And now let's try and do it and make sure it looks really good on a camera. Oh, God, really?
But then also it advertises the show.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's good.
Yeah. So you then feel a responsibility for it. Yeah, it's slightly terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I also think the concept of previews is slightly...
Doesn't really exist anymore.
Well,
we certainly don't charge less for
I was going to say, there's an issue with the pricing, isn't there? But also, I mean, I think it's partially a function of things like celebrity casting. That's not even a good way of putting it. I did a Macbeth with Sean Bean many, many years ago. And it was like literally in the early days of the internet. Okay, and we had various technological problems on the first preview. We were still teching at 6:30 or whatever, all those things that you do. And after I got home, I sort of went on the internet on dial-up. If anyone wants to do a dial-up sound to illustrate the story, they can. And there were all these people on this kind of forum talking about the fact the house had opened late, and which of course was a foreshadow of things to come. That from the first preview, everything is going to be dissected.
Yep.
Okay, so the idea that somehow this is a tryout and we can put some drafts of things in. This is not actually how
you're putting it in front of people.
Yeah.
So you might change it subsequently, but it can't be a draft. It's got to be.
No, well, we really came a couple when I did Hamlet at the Barbican with Jane Cox, that Lindsay Turner had directed, and I still can't really remember why, but the national press came along and 2 national papers reviewed it on the first preview, and that just felt like they'd come to look at us with our knickers around our ankles. It was really hard, like this is a draft of what we're going to do. And at that point we had a speech in a place that it doesn't normally appear in the show, which ultimately we changed by the time we got to press night. But it felt like we'd lost that contract that we used to go into with audiences in previews. We were like, we will charge you less money and we are asking you. And it's that thing that I always find when we're teching a show, having watched a show in rehearsals and then we tech it and then we do a couple of dress rehearsals if we're lucky. The thing that is always missing is the audience, and they are a key element which informs everything. I mean, it mainly informs what the director is expecting, but there are moments where it really does tell a lighting designer what to do if we've not thrown the focus to the right person. It's the thing that I find funny. Another thing when we do NT Live things is that I feel very impotent as a lighting technician as I become at that point, that what I do as a programmer is I tell people where to look because I point lights and I try and convince an audience where to focus their attention, and my power to do that is taken away when the camera just focuses in on a head and shoulders of somebody. I don't get to figure out where to tell the audience where to look. I don't get to see an audience not paying attention or missing a joke because potentially we've not given you the framework within which to see that joke, or we've not highlighted the right things, or we've drawn your attention to something else. The audience are expecting something polished on the first performance, and that's really hard to achieve when actually they're the missing element quite often. We know what we think is funny, but often in a rehearsal room or in a technical situation, we're looking at an in-joke that we think is hilarious because the last time somebody did that, they fell over. And that seemed really funny, so let's keep it in. And then you put it in front of an audience, and they're like, well, why did they fall over? That doesn't make any... Why have you got a follow spot on that? That doesn't make any sense.
It's the time we first step back, isn't it? And we look at it in full, as it runs, all of us.
And I think what's interesting, I think a lot of people would assume that a programmer doesn't do that, or that a programmer gets to first preview and goes, whew, great.
Maybe this is back to the role of the programmer.
Yeah, Well, it's
in
also
terms
like because I think a programmer's role is one thing in previews, and I also think that in the UK this is a slightly separate conversation, and I'm not sure if I think it's a good idea or a bad idea, but I think a programmer in the UK fulfills quite a lot of an American associate or assistant's role.
Right.
So we are supportive of a lighting designer. We are the person that they discuss how things should look.
But how we're billed in terms of the production, I think there is a question in there that we haven't yet quite broached about how we are looked at in terms of the production company. Are we part of the creative team? Are we part of the technical team? Where do we lie on the signing in sheet?
Are we even on the signing in sheet?
I was going to say, I'm never on the signing in sheet. I'm constantly
Do we
writing my
get
name
invited
better.
to the first night party?
So,
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting thing, and I think
Do they know where to put us?
and that's why I have a bell.
oh yeah,
Because if you're loud, people might go, well, we should probably do something with her.
yeah. She'll bring the bell to the party.
But I think
oh
it
no,
is-
hang on, no, we should not invite her.
Well, I think it's really interesting because I'm gonna say boring things every now and again, like when I was in America, which is very boring. But
Is this going to be about when you were in America? yeah.
I can't believe you're saying about American.
for the benefit of the tape, I have just been in the US doing King Kong, and it was a very unusual experience for me because I had never done a show there before. I have worked with very few American lighting designers in the UK, but I was a bit nervous. I don't often work with associates in the UK because they are not particularly prevalent here, because there is no money to pay for them. But in the US, that is you cannot do a show without an associate. And I had the team was the lighting designer, associate lighting designer, assistant lighting designer, programmer, show chief, production electrician, 3 follow spots, 2 deck electricians, and a house electrician. I'd never had so many staff on a show. And having a dedicated associate and assistant was phenomenal because they were able to do the things that I am normally wishing I was an octopus enabled to be able to do. So making all the notes, keeping track of the things that need to be updated on the plan, making the list of the things that are broken, making sure that the follow spots know what they're doing, checking that everyone's made sure that they've had the right breaks, knowing what the ongoing notes are so that I can double check that, checking with the house electrician that I've got the right dimmers for the follow spots. All of that stuff was taken care of by some other people. Whereas in the UK, we fulfil so many of those
It's good,
roles.
isn't it? I think it's the way forward, personally.
I think there's a happy medium
Yeah.
somewhere in between the two.
No, right.
Like, I love the fact that I get to be part of the design process, and I feel so privileged to be able to, and I don't want to design. I've had a go at it. It's not for me. But I love being next to a designer and having none of the responsibility.
So, given all those different roles that you were working with in America, how, by the production company, how was the programmer perceived?
Well, it was
in light of what we've just said. Were they perceived as part of the creative team?
In America, they are perceived as part of the creative team. Yeah. It was difficult on that show because I was billed as associate and programmer.
Oh, okay.
But I was interested to know if that was not the case. Partly, I want to know who I'm going for dinner with. Am I hanging out and waiting for the crew to go for dinner, or am I going straight with the creative team? And that is basically how I judge it. I would just like to know where I'm eating at 6 o'clock. And in the UK, I'm eating with the designers, and in the States, I was eating with the designers. And I think that has changed. I think when I started, I probably would have eaten with the crew. And I still am not sure if I'm really a member of the... I think in the States, I'm absolutely a member of the creative team. I think in the UK, I'm still in limbo. I'm kind of happy with that.
And I wonder if that's confusing for the rest of the creative team.
I think it
Like
depends...
where to put you all, how to...
Yeah, and I think, again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It depends on the designer. So I think Peter Mumford absolutely says that I am part of the creative team. But I think there are other designers, and I'm struggling to think of one now, who would probably not invite me for dinner. It's just a different way of approaching it. And I think the way Peter approaches it is that a lot of the decisions are made around the dinner table or are made in the pub after the show. We'll make some good decisions, but the ideas that are kind of formulated after the show are the ones that we're going to percolate on overnight. And that's the room that he wants me to be in, because I'll be the person who ultimately needs to know if we're able to do that. But I don't know if that's because Peter sees me as an associate / programmer, and whether that would be the case if it was somebody who he just thought was going to punch the numbers.
Yeah, because I think ultimately what he's probably interested in doing is having the person around the table, not that you're necessarily going to contribute to what the solution should be, but the person who can say whether the solution that's proposed is actually going to work.
Absolutely.
Or is technically achievable.
I think when I am treated by the production company, whether it be the signing in sheet or whatever it might be, as not a member of the creative team, that jars a little bit.
See, that had never occurred to me, but now that you say it,
I don't. It doesn't matter that much, but it feels like I am there on the front line with the designer, and yet I am not perceived as part of that creative process. Yeah. I'm sure it's not meant like that. I'm sure that's not how it actually is, but somehow, like you say, you're sort of left in limbo, and I'm sure that's the case for everybody involved, that you are perhaps seen in limbo.
Well, I feel like if we did like a straw poll, like a vox pop of, 8 out of 10 designers would say my programmer is part of my creative team.
I think there's a difference between being part of the designer's creative process, which I think you absolutely are, necessarily being part of the creative team.
Yes, I think I'm part of the designer's creative team.
I think that's a good thing to say.
I'm 100% part of number one. Yeah. I'm agnostic about whether I'm part of number two.
But I think that's a great thing to say. Yeah. Because maybe that is a unique place to be, actually.
Well, there's also a political thing. We've talked about this before.
Who, you and I?
Yeah, and not like it's some sort of trusty thing that we did at ABTT or something, where we talked about how, as a programmer, how should you be with the member of the creative team who are not the lighting designer? What's the appropriate level of familiarity with them?
I do remember that question.
Versus the fact that if you are overly familiar with them, the moment the lighting designer walks out the door to go for a wee,
will they take
the creative team appear at the production desk and say, would it just be possible to change these 8 things? To which the answer is no, because there is no way forward in that really. The creative process has to happen through the right channels, and that if you are talking about the lighting, that has to happen through the lighting design. There is no other way.
No, I completely concur with that.
So I kind of want. I think that has some bearing on the conversation we were having about where do you sit. Because I'm always delighted to hang out with the director, with the designer, whatever. It's always really lovely, really nice. But I would always try to make it clear that my key allegiance is to the lighting designer, not. And I think the danger is if you are perceived as being part of the creative team, there's a danger that your voice might be perceived to be as important as the lighting design.
Yes, that's a good distinction.
And that is the wrong thing. Okay, not because I might have some fucking great ideas, okay, but ultimately I'm not. That's not my job. I think the thing that's most important about being a programmer with the lighting designer is that the lighting designer has to believe ultimately that you are totally in their corner. Yeah. Like that's what it comes down to. They have to believe that you. So whatever they decide, you have to be willing to go into bat to make that work.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be part of the bigger creative team, that's lovely, but it can't compromise the fact that when it comes to creative discussions, those discussions have to happen by the designer.
Yeah.
Because there's no other way for that to happen, I don't think.
And I think that's made harder and I had a long conversation with Vivian Leone, a brilliant American associate who Andi has worked with a lot before. The thing that Vivian was saying was, is it not hard to be the programmer and the associate at the same time?
Yes.
If the lighting designer goes away, you step up and become the lighting designer designate for the week that they're away, the 2 days, however long. Then they go away and the designer comes back and you then have to go back to your original role, but the creative team have got used to you in that elevated role and are used to having that conversation and having that feedback and having you implement those ideas. And it hadn't really occurred to me that it was as much about somebody else adjusting to that as it is to you fulfilling that role. And I enjoy doing it when I don't have to pretend to be the lighting designer. That's the point at which I don't want to be the associate. But that's the point at which actually the associate thing is actually what you're meant to be doing.
I mean, I personally think that if you're actually... I think the idea of being a programmer and also doing a bit of the associate's job that involves trying to wrangle the rig and deal with kind of some degrees of paperwork and notes and stuff, I think that's fine. I am not a fan of the idea of trying to program and actually stand in for the lighting designer.
Well, I think it's a bit of a false economy, because I think if you ever take that show on tour and the lighting designer isn't available, you're going to have to find another person to do one or other of those jobs.
I basically think you need two sets of hands. Okay, you need someone to deal with the desk shit and you need someone to look at the stage.
Yes.
Okay. So it's not really about whether can a programmer also be an associate. The answer is probably yes. Okay, but the question is, can the programmer actually do two things at once? And the answer is no, they can't. They can either look at the stage or they can look at the screen. And that's basically how it goes.
And they'll just end up doing both things kind of poorly.
Badly. Yeah, certainly that's just my experience. I've done both of those things badly. So I think the idea of being with a designer and doing some associate backup role is totally cool. The idea of actually being an associate trying to relight a show or light a show, worse still, whilst programming, I think is a.
I think certainly if it's a big show and it's on a large forum where there's an awful lot of people,
lots of voices in the room.
Yeah, I think if it's if we're moving a show, if it's
it's a different.
That seems like it's more manageable.
Making original content.
Yes.
You need two sets of eyes. You need somebody to actually be doing the tinkling of the ivories, and you need somebody to be looking at the stage.
I concur.
And it's not really about what the skill sets of those people are. It's just the fact that you need two of them.
Also, I think there's a lot of really good people in the industry that deserve an opportunity, and I think there's enough work to go around. But for better or for worse, and the reasons are many and various in their budgets and their time and their various other things, that we are being constricted more and more. And there's also a thing about, would I rather spend the money on... I mean, I'm going to have if I'm a lighting designer, I'm probably going to have a programmer, because that's just how we're going to get the show on. But do I really need to have an associate, or can I just get the programmer to sort of do bits of that, and then the money that I would spend on that I can probably put into the rig, or I can put into something that's more useful? And those conversations are really hard, I think.
It's interesting I don't really know why it is that associates have become... Like, I think having associates is great, basically.
I agree, and I never used to.
But I don't know why it is that that's become a thing that is, absolutely not questioned in America, and why it's a thing that here is, you've got to go out on a limb. It does not appear to be provided for in the budget.
No, that is the problem.
But is, I think, provided when we get a show over from the States. I think
But that's because the contracts that are written in the States have to be respected here. That's how the producers write the contracts.
But I suspect that loads of kind of production managers and people are kind of go, we're going to definitely need to budget for an associate because it's an American show. But that doesn't translate
that's
to going,
interesting.
Why? In fact, no matter the legalities of it, why? Do you know what I mean? Why is it?
Yay, but can we just have that apply to us as well, please?
Because there are some great people trying to work as associates in the UK, but it's not possible to make a living doing it.
Yeah.
Really, I don't think. I mean, it's hard. Certainly the two people I can think of off the top of my head, neither of them, I think, would say that they make their career full-time being associates, because they would say they occasionally have to get the spanners out because it isn't possible to actually, there's enough work to do it full-time. And in the US, I don't doubt that those people would be.
I mean, Vince's been doing it for how many years now?
Yeah, exactly.
And that is a career.
Yeah, I disagree. Yeah, absolutely.
And a really valuable one, I think. And
in fact, not only do they have associates, but they also have assistants.
Yeah.
And, if you're doing a show of any scale, you will also have an assistant.
Yeah.
So that's actually 1.5 to 2 entire roles.
Just delightful.
Yeah, that we don't have here. Really.
I really thought I'd be against it. I really thought I'd bristle about it and feel like some of my role or my power or my skill was being sucked away. And I am freaking out about having to do a musical without those two people sat behind me. Because I just think, I think they were phenomenal. The people that I had working on that show were incredible.
Name check.
Kirk Fitzgerald as the assistant, also fabulous Broadway associate, and Joel Shire. Exceptional human beings, but also so good at their jobs. Really understood what it was that I was doing, had a respect for what I was doing, and because of that it meant that I was able to have a respect for what they were doing because they didn't try and step on my toes. They were very kind to me as a foreigner in New York, in a scary place. But because they are very clear on what their jobs are, and it is very clear within the team, the production electrician knows the chain of command in terms of how the notes work. There was a time when the production electrician and both the associate and the assistant sort of had to teach Peter and I the way it worked.
How it goes, yes, absolutely.
And they were very kind about that, and once we sort of had got our head around it, it ran like clockwork.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an
also
incredibly...
important that you do it that way. I mean, certainly...
I mean, they were very forgiving to us because, you know, we were from out of town.
Yeah, but, you know, giving notes directly to the production electrician will not endear you.
Yeah.
You know, and that is...
I mean, I think some of that has softened a little since you were there last, or certainly our production electrician was very kind. So I feel like we should wrap it up.
We should.
Because we've been doing it for like 2 hours.
Extremely late.
So I thought the last question I think I'm going to ask is...
Have we actually answered how do you become a programmer?
I don't know that
we answered how we became
programmers.
programmers,
Talk about it. Because we should really, given that isn't basically the whole reason for this.
That is why I think we should be doing this
podcast.
Because I don't...
Well done,
the reason
you listened for 2 hours for us to get round to
But the reason I haven't asked that question is because I don't think there's an answer.
Well, I think that's what you need to say.
Oh, I should have started, then no one would have listened.
Yeah, this podcast, you know, it's pointless. Don't listen to it.
I certainly don't think... So let's go back. So the reason I wanted to do this podcast is I get asked an awful lot by people, how do you become a programmer? The thing that I think is true is I don't think it's quick. I don't think it happens within a couple of weeks. I don't think it happens because you graduated from drama school. I'm really sorry. I don't think it happens because you've done a couple of shows with a lighting designer. I think the reason I am a programmer is because I do it all the time because a lighting designer or two took a chance on me and gave me some jobs. And it's that awful thing about theatre, about it not being what you know, but about who you know. And I think that's not true. I think it's about what you know and about who you know. And I think you have to be good in the first instance. But partly the reason I think I'm all right at what I do is because I do it all the bloody time.
Yes, that is.
I don't have time not to be good.
No, that is definitely true. I think it's worth saying that essentially, I think to be a programmer, you need to be exposed and to be around doing making a lot of shows.
Yes.
Okay, and that is why a lot of programmers have come up through producing venues.
I agree.
So that is true of Vic, when Vic's just given a quick summary of kind of how she's become, what she has, you know, talked about earlier, but not maybe at that moment, is the fact that she's kind of exposed to making a lot of shows at the Royal Shakespeare Company. Okay,
oh yeah, when I started programming, my first show I think was Richard III in 2003, and I left in 2006, and by that stage, I think I'd programmed about 40 shows, and I'd worked on about 100 in various capacities, and I think I learnt bits about how to do my job in every single one of the shows, not just the 40 that I pushed the buttons on, but the 60 that I either turned around learning how heavy a light is to pick it up, or being a follow spot operator and learning the terminology and being behind a light and all of that sort of stuff, I think was invaluable.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that's really annoying advice, isn't it? I mean, like, it's really...
Totally.
It's really nauseating.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I was a casual for 3 years at the Royal Shakespeare Company. I can tell you that none of that advice would have been palatable to me at that time. It would have been really fucking tedious. Okay, it is true. Okay, it is true, but it is...
Would it not also be true to say that whilst both you and I were casuals at the RSC, admittedly at different times, I certainly was too drunk to notice or pay any attention.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
I had the most fun.
Yeah.
I met incredible people, one of whom I'm still sat opposite at a dinner table.
Still drunk, in fact.
Still as drunk as I would have been back then.
Yeah.
But I made incredible contacts. I also was put in front of lighting designers in a way that, as a freelancer, I have never been put in front of lighting designers.
No.
They were forced to work with me.
Yeah. They didn't want to.
Much against their better judgment.
I'm sorry, it's compulsory.
And it would also be fair to admit that there are a great number of them that I do not work with now because they made up their mind there and then. But I have made friends for life, as well as people that I just see socially, but also people that I work professionally, who I know from my time there. I also think there are things that I live my life. I had a lot of conversations with you this week, Sarah, and I realise that I live my life quite a lot in opposition to things. I see things that I do not want to be or do not want to do. But I see things and I go, I feel like I learn from an awful lot of things that I saw while I was at the RSC. A lot of things I learned by going, that's a great thing, I'm going to take that with me. But there was a number of things where I went,
that's Bug Smashers, let's not do that.
I absolutely don't want to be that person or do that thing. And that was all really useful.
Gosh, that's an amazing thing to say. I hadn't thought of that.
I hadn't thought about that until this week when I suddenly realised that a lot of questions that you were asking me, I kept saying, well, no, I saw that and I didn't want to do that, or I didn't want to be that. And actually, that's kind of valuable.
Yeah.
And that's a thing that I don't think I'd really appreciated. That part of my education, and also it's because I read Emma Rice got a doctorate a couple of weeks ago from Nottingham Trent University, and she was like, I didn't go to university here, but I'm very grateful for this thing. And the thing that I love about it is that I grew up here and I know this place, and this place taught me things. And partly it was things that I wanted to be, and partly it was things I wanted to escape. And I think there's something really interesting about being exposed not just to the things that are perfect. I read a really interesting article in BuzzFeed this week about millennials and why there's a problem in the job market. And it's because millennials are not given the opportunity just to go and experience stuff anymore. You kind of have to get a career straight away. You have to do a job that's cool and that your parents will be proud of. You can't just go and have a gap year or work at a donkey sanctuary or something.
I think what struck me about what we were talking about earlier when we all sort of started, that the three of us started, is that we worked within the team as technicians, and therefore, and I personally enjoyed that very much, to be part of that camaraderie and be part of that teamwork. And
that's the thing I really miss. I miss that community now.
Yeah, I think I do a bit as well. And I, yeah.
I don't, but I'm miserable.
Yeah,
so
that's
fine.
okay.
Yeah.
But that was really good team building sort of learning, I think, as well, to do that physical work within the technical team.
Yeah.
To
but I also think
loading trucks and unloading trucks and putting up rigs and you know, I enjoyed my days doing that. I wasn't terribly good at it, but I did enjoy it.
But I have a slight jealousy of you doing things like learning how to mix a show and flying in a hemp house and doing bits
Don't
of
be
projects.
jealous of flying in a hemp
But
house.
I think, but that gives you an overall idea and an appreciation and a sensitivity to what other people are doing. And I was having this conversation with somebody recently who had done an intensive course where she'd learned a load of things in 9 weeks. And she was like, it's been really, really hard, but I think it's been really useful. And I said, I love it because I think it means that if I have an appreciation of how time-consuming it might be to unpick and resew a garment, I'm hoping that other people in the team might understand how painful my job might be. They might not understand that, you know, when I'm trying to make an effect that does something that the lighting designer is asking for and I can't make it happen, that they might cut me a bit of slack because they have an appreciation or some kind of mutual respect across what we do. Yeah. And if I hadn't done a job where, when I was at the RSC on the stage right wing, sat in the wings chatting to the dressers about the things that they were doing, like, we've all got our own gripes and our own beefs.
Exactly, yeah.
But had I just been sat behind the production desk, that's a lonely and isolated place.
Yeah.
You can really start to forget the rest of the world of the show.
Yeah, I think you can. And
there was a time when, and I do it less and less, but I might start doing it again. I used to have like a massive bowl of sweets on the desk so that people would just come and talk to us, because people never disturb you, because we're working so hard that people feel like you're unapproachable. So you get to the press night party and you introduce yourself to people and they're like, oh, well, great. So did you see the show tonight? And I was like, I've been working on it for 10 weeks. Have you?
But you're behind a lighting desk in the dark.
Yeah, they see the top of your head and nobody comes to talk to you.
Maybe that's why I like it.
I worry that might be the case.
No, I think that is the case. So do we have a solution? The question is, do we have a solution? I'm 19 and 3/4 and I want to become a lighting programmer. How do I do it?
Oh, I'd say get a better job.
That's the wrong answer.
I know.
So, Brown, you can have a go instead.
Well, I think what do you want to be? A lighting programmer?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
You really want to be a lighting programmer?
I mean, I've been thinking that for a while now.
Well, I mean, obviously, because I have come up through the subsidised theatre route.
Apprenticeships.
I would recommend that, because if you go and work in a subsidised theatre, even if you don't go in as a programmer, but you have a leaning towards programming, then at least you are exposed to lots and lots of shows being made, and you are in that factory that's making them.
Be part of making
and
shit.
you are exposed to designers and and part of making shows often, and you're paid to be there. So that's what I think I would recommend, because that was my route.
And I think designers sniff it out a bit as well. I think they spot people like that. I think the conversations that you have in the crew room or over comms, or if you're a good follow spot operator, if they're not having to wake you up or they're not having to explain to you that yes, the person who's still dressed in the yellow is Malvolio, that's the person that you're meant to be picking up. They spot that. There's a gravitational pull to people who have the vocabulary or have the instinct for it that I think lighting designers are intrigued by.
But also you're in a safe-ish environment, and you could potentially discuss your whatever. You could discuss programming with other people within that institution, and that's quite a, because programmers could potentially be quite isolated in the freelance world. I think if you're just starting out, then being within a subsidised theatre could be less exposing as you learn.
Yeah.
I think...
Go on then, And. How do they do it?
Well, here's the thing. If Sarah Brown had said what she said 2 comments ago at the start of the evening, we could have saved ourselves the whole thing. Okay. Because ultimately, being a lighting programmer is basically about making shows. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
And ultimately, if you want to learn how to make shows, the best place to be is a factory that makes shows, okay? And that means basically subsidised theatres. Okay, it's virtually impossible to be exposed to that amount of show creation, if you like. Coming out of college or whatever, it's virtually impossible to do that on a freelance basis. You can't do it. Okay, you can't. Okay. Ultimately, if you want to be a programmer, you have to be in an environment where people are making shows. Okay, and you'll probably end up doing some menial shit. Okay, but the
menial shit can be fun.
Firstly, menial shit can be fun. Okay, and also, and this is really nauseating. I hate myself for saying it. Okay, you will probably be learning it whilst you're doing it. Okay, that is super galling, and I would not have wanted to hear that at the time. So feel free to think off. But nevertheless, it is true. And the ultimate truth is that nowhere makes shows with the kind of, the turnover that the major producing houses do. Okay, and
so big shout outs to RSC, National Theatre, ENO, Royal Opera House, Chichester, Manchester Royal Exchange, Lyric Hammersmith, Hampstead. Incredible places. Young Vic.
Old Vic.
Old Vic.
Well, maybe not Old Vic.
You can't take back. You can't take back.
Nottingham, Scarborough. These are incredible places. The is it the New Vic, the one that's in the Round in Newcastle under Lyme? All these places are incredible. The Stephen Joseph in Scarborough, the Bolton Octagon, all these places where you will go, you'll earn very little money, and that is appalling, and I can't apologise enough for that. But you won't have to pay back your student loan. You'll be pissed almost constantly. You will meet friends for life.
And you might learn about programming, which would be amazing.
And even if you don't, you'll have stories to tell for the rest of your life.
And somebody will make you go on a podcast.
And somebody will make you go on a podcast eventually. And I'm very sorry